Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie and I work here at Vegas PBS in the programming department. Thank you for being here and sending your questions. We hope you enjoyed the special screening of The Donut King. To see it again, tune in to Vegas PBS Channel 10 this Sunday, May 30th at 11 p.m. or stream it on vegaspbs.org. I am now honored to introduce your host for this evening, Patranya Bhoosuwan. She is a three-time Emmy-winning journalist with over 2 decades of experience as a reporter and anchor across the U.S. She is also the founder of Patranya Media. Patranya, go ahead, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction. So happy to be here and to take part in this community panel. I personally really enjoyed that documentary, which I saw for the first time a few weeks ago. So I hope that you're all who are watching, who just watched this documentary, enjoyed it as well. I think it brings up a lot of topics, especially in light of this being Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. It's really great to highlight this story of Ted Ngo, and also documentary filmmaker. The woman who made this was is an AAPI woman as well, Alice Gu. So I think that's really great to highlight her work. And I'm so honored to be joined by this panel with me today, who I'm going to introduce here, who just notable AAPI community leaders, educators here in the Southern Nevada area. So I'm going to start with Vida Lin, who I've known for many years. She's the founder and president of the Asian Community Development Council, or ACDC. This group empowers, educates, and connects Asian American communities across Nevada. And I also work with her personally, as well as the media consultant for ACDC. So it's great to see her on this panel. She does so many great things for the community. Also joining us here, Catherine Kuo, who is a commercial real estate broker and investor here in Southern Nevada. She also is a small business owner and originally from the East Coast, now makes Nevada home. So she's done great things in the community as well. So we're going to talk more with Kathy in just a little bit. And we have 2 professors from UNLV joining us today. We have Federick Ngo, and his family actually, his parents are refugees from Cambodia, and he actually grew up, well, he was born on the East Coast, and he actually grew up in Long Beach, which I just found out through Federick, that is known as Cambodian Town, largest Cambodian population outside of Cambodia. So he has a really great perspective to share as well. He's currently the assistant professor of higher education at UNLV. And also joining us, Mark Padoongpatt is also from UNLV. He is the director of Asian and Asian American Studies. He's also Thai, like me, Thai American. So glad to have my brother Mark on the show. He's also a published author here, Flavors of the Empire, Food and the Making of Thai America. So if you haven't read that book, definitely pick it up. So yeah, such a great panel we have today, and what a great documentary. And before we start, I have a little surprise for all of you. I have a little surprise. Look at this. I got the pink box. Well, we talked, you heard about the pink box, right? In this documentary and I did not know this. I thought it was really interesting how Ted was actually kind of brought the pink box into our experience of donuts. And I got 2. Sorry, I didn't have one for everyone, but it's virtual. So I got 2, but I actually got glaze, which was supposed to be Ted's favorite, so I got that, and I got my favorite, which is sprinkles. So anyways, I'll share with you all when I see you. But anyways, I thought it'd be cute to bring a pink donut box. I actually went to a donut shop right before this, and the man who was in there, I had to ask him, like, are you Cambodian? Because I just want to know. And he's like, no, but he's Asian, so that I thought that was really interesting. But anyway, so I thought I had to bring that to the conversation. But I want to hear first from all of you what you thought about this documentary, just so we'll kind of get roundtable about this. Vida, I'll start with you. When I don't know if you heard about Ted's story before, but when you heard this story, and you've been, you grew up as a kid of business owners in California, kind of similar experience. Like when you heard the story, it must be kind of resonate to you in some ways.
Yes, exactly. When I heard the story, it reminds me of my family when my parents came to San Francisco in the 1960, in that time and era. And when they owned little, they work in restaurants before as a dishwasher. My mom worked in a sweatshop. And then eventually they put money together and families and relatives lending them money. So they opened their first restaurant, right? So they had the restaurant coffee shop. And then 10 years after that, they got out of that area because where we were living, it got kind of dangerous. So we moved out of the area and opened another restaurant. And from one, we opened 11 locations. So we do know about the story about the family all working in the restaurant together and trying to build, and never had weekends off, never had holidays off. And, Mother's Day was one of the busiest days for us and so forth. So it was, bringing other families and helping build their future and their business. And they will have their kids and they will send them to school. Some became doctors, lawyers, CPA, and so forth. So that story really resonated to me, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, and that's great. And, that immigrant mentality, right? When Vida, we were talking about all the families working in there, that's how they save money, because the labor, and Ted talked about this, like his kids and grandkids, and they're all working in the donut shop industry. So I thought that was really interesting. So yeah, we'll come back and Vida, talk a little bit about your experience and maybe similar in terms of some of the business owners and workers who've, been affected in the same way that Ted was when he came to Vegas, so that was really interesting. So we'll have you talk about that in a little bit. But Kathy, share your story with me, because I thought was really interesting was that your family actually owned donut shops, but Dunkin' Donuts on the East Coast when you were growing up, right?
So my family, first generation immigrants, my parents came to here from Taiwan with almost no money, and they just hustled, worked hard, saved their money and started their own businesses. Basically, as long as I've been alive, they've owned different businesses. And one of the first, when I was just like a toddler up to until I was like maybe 5 or 6 years old, they owned 2 Dunkin' Donut shops. So I was that kid in the corner doing my homework, hanging out there and eating donuts a lot, actually, because, when you're poor and your family owns that business, you get all the leftovers from the end of the day. And that really set the foundation, though. And I think, what resonated with me is just like that American dream. That's something I'm so passionate about. Everyone who knows me knows that. And it's why I do what I do for a living, actually, because my main job and my clients are all small business owners. And so I love helping people bring that dream to fruition and helping them plan. So, just knowing that whole process, having gone through it multiple times with my own family, and then with countless clients, like I love seeing that come to fruition all the time.
Yeah. And you were talking about that, humble and hungry, right? That's the kind of, we grew up with that. And I think we really saw that in documentary, all the dreams and helping each other. And I think that was your experience, Kathy, maybe seeing other families, how they struggle, and you want to kind of, be successful because of that, right?
Yeah, and one of the reasons I got involved with Vida and OCA and ACDC is because I'm really big on mentorship and paying it forward. Yeah. And I have a lot of mentees, a lot of them are Asian students. And one of the biggest things I say is that humbleness, like I think one of the refugees had said that he's like, I didn't care what I had to do. I didn't care if I had to scrub toilets. I just knew I had to do what I had to do to get it. And I was so grateful for that. And that's what I tell people. I'm like, be humble. Like, don't think you're above any kind of task. Don't think you're above anyone. Be willing to do whatever it takes. Don't let that ego get to you. And I think a lot of people do, or they think like, oh, I shouldn't do that. I'm college educated. I can't do that. I'm like, I still do all the things. Like, I've sorted trash at our properties when I've had to. And this is recent. It's like 2-3 years ago. Yeah. And so just having that mentality of doing whatever it takes.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people can relate to that, especially, in the immigrant community across the US as well. Federick, I want to go to you and your parents are also refugees from Cambodia during that kind of wave, maybe the second wave after Ted came to the US during the 80s. And so tell me about your experience watching this documentary. Did it bring back a lot of memories for you?
Definitely. I mean, I saw in Ted's story, the story of a lot of my own family members who have worked in donut shops, have owned donut shops, have struggled to find, entry points into the labor force and into business ownership and mobility. And so, yeah, it was just really, it's nice to see yourself and your story and your family story on screen and told to a broader audience, right? I think that's what we all desire to see in the media a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think that what Ted's story shows is that, you know, on the one hand, like refugees have struggled to enter and create businesses, and at the same time, they have also benefited from social support for immigrants and refugees, which I'm hoping we can probably discuss later about, you know, the current state of immigration and refugee issues as well. So I think, you know, it's like a fun and beautiful story, but it's also, it highlights some of the issues that we see today as well.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be an interesting part of this conversation, you know, just kind of the immigration policies then compared to, you know, in recent years and how that had affect immigrant communities from around the world. So I think that's been kind of really interesting for me to see, you know, and I love how this documentary just brings in footages from, you know, so many parts of history that we've learned and touched on, and they kind of combine that really well. And I thought that the filmmaker really did a good job of relaying not just the immigrant history, but the history of Southern California, the history of donuts and food culture and all of that, and be able to combine that really well and tell a great story. I thought that was great. And Mark, I know you have a passion for food. You know, your book is about Thai food and you know, the history of Thai food in the US. What was your first reaction watching this story? And I know you've heard about Tess story before, right? You were going to teach it in your class at one point.
Yeah, no, I had, you know, like everybody, you know, I have so much to say. It was such a robust documentary. It got me thinking about a lot of things. And as you mentioned, you know, I teach about Ted in my courses, but I really use his story and his donut empire as a way, like Federick mentioned, like as a way to talk about the refugee and Southeast Asian experience more broadly. And so I think the thing that really, one major thing that I think is important and that really resonated with me being Southeast, being Thai American, being born and raised here, was that, you know, it shows really well that not all Asian Americans are immigrants, right? That like there's immigrants and then there's refugees and then there's, you know, there's people who come here involuntarily. Right. And in this case, you know, Southeast Asians, we came because we were on the receiving end of the Vietnam War, right? And so we're here because the US was there. And I think that in itself makes the documentary really important. And I found that to be really important was that, you know, we talk about the complexity of Asian America, and here it is in full display, right? That this is a group that Cambodian, Khmer Americans don't really get talked about unless they're talked about as like just victims or refugees. But this was, what I loved about the documentary was like, here are Khmer Americans and Cambodian Americans building lives. And we don't often get to see that, right? It's usually like they're struggling, they're refugees, they need help, or they're a problem that we have to address. But here they are, you know, making donuts, changing the industry, building lives, trying to build lives and roots. And so I found that to be really, that's really resonated with me.
Yeah, and you brought up a great point, especially now that we're, you know, Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, how we're highlighting, which I believe should be all year round, shouldn't just be 1 month. You know, do we have so many experiences that we can share? But I think what's great about this, and you brought up a good point about diversity and how, you know, a lot of times, especially now that we're dealing with discrimination and violence, you know, people see Asian Americans as just one group, right, as a monolith, where we're definitely not. You know, we represent just in this group alone that we're talking here, you know, Chinese American, Thai American, Cambodian American, and it's, you know, there's so much cultures and experiences there, and I agree with you. This and not just one experience. You know, like people come and do different things in this country. They're not, you know, immigrants, refugees. They come in for different reasons. So I think this is a great story to highlight that. You know, and Federick, let me ask you, as a Cambodian American, seeing Ted as this person that they're portraying, what does that say to you? I mean, is it kind of, when you think about Cambodian American families, I mean, is that kind of like, it's pretty accurate of like telling the story and seeing that community on screen?
So what I found was funny was when I was in college, I wrote my essentially a senior thesis or senior paper it was called Sweet Cambodian American Dreams. And, you know, as a 21-year-old, I went out and interviewed a bunch of donut shop owners, because I just thought this was a fascinating story.
Yeah.
And what I learned with that, and it was kind of also just elaborated upon in the documentary, was like, these were just like really loose networks of community members, right? They weren't, you know, some of them were Ted's immediate family, but it was also just like word of mouth. Oh, I know this guy, this friend of my friend is doing well, and let me go talk to him. And I think it shows actually the connectedness of these like ethnic communities, and including the Cambodian American community. So that, I think that is very real. Like there's this ethnic kinship, right? That through which this social capital like is created. A funny story with that is when I was directed, I was an undergrad at Stanford, and I was directed to go meet with this faculty person to advise me on my paper. And when I met with him, he referenced this paper, The Strength of Weak Ties. And I read this paper. Turns out is Mark Granovetter. It was the person that I was talking to. I didn't know. I was, you know, like, I did not know.
Small world.
He was like actually a very big sociologist at the time.
Wow.
That sort of came up with this idea of weak ties, and like the strength of weak ties. Like there are these relationships and connections, the community that we have that really amount to a whole lot more than they seem.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And I just, I'm writing a newspaper story about this Thai American chef in Seattle, actually, who just passed away unexpectedly. And when I'm learning of his story, I learned that through his restaurant, so many Thai chefs have gone through there, or, you know, new Thai coming into America, and they learned the skills from him and went and opened their own restaurants. So I think they're Ted's story all over the country, not just donut shops, you know, but other Asian American communities, how they're helping each other to get where they needed to go. And in Ted's story, we talk about how he sponsored, you know, over 100 Cambodian families and got them to this country and got them to start and got them to the business. And I think it's just really interesting, and just talk about that, like you said, the kinship. And Kathy, talk to me about your experience, because your families, they started businesses, right, on the East Coast. So in New York, where you grew up. And tell me about that experience growing up. What did you remember most about the communities around you, not just with your family, but just that whole immigrant community?
So we started a few businesses. We had the donut shops, we had a carpet store at one point, and then really our main business for the past probably 35, 40 years has been real estate. And there's definitely that, you know, my mother had a mentor, you know, so someone who's Asian in the community, and taught her how to do that, how to like start with house hacking, getting multifamily homes, getting apartments here and there, and like how to structure deals. And we like eventually built up our portfolio, but in the beginning, it was very little money. Again, a few $1,000s, maybe, you know, cash on hand. That was when you can finance a lot easier than nowadays. So, you know, there's definitely the benefit of time back then, and the circumstances, right place at the right time, but also just like that hard work and being willing to put that time in, and being willing to sacrifice. And for me, I think growing up, what I hated at the time, because I was like, you know, all my white friends, I grew up in suburban Long Island, all my white friends got to like hang out after school or go play sports. And my mom would be like, hop in the car, we're gonna go look at properties for like 3 or 4 or 5 hours after school. And you're gonna tell me why you think this is good. You're gonna run the numbers, you're gonna do the Excel file and underwrite this. And you're gonna run comps for me on this like MLS system. And I was like 14 maybe, you know, at the time I was like, can I go hang out with my friends? I'm a teenager. Like, I want to enjoy my life, you know, but she's like, no, because I don't know how to use the computer. And this is your job because you're part of the family. So it wasn't a do what makes you happy. It wasn't a, can you help me with this? It was like, you do this or you're not going to eat tonight, or you're not going to have a place to stay. Like, you know, it wasn't a choice. And again, like, I think that's a lot of Asian children growing up in family businesses. Like we were forced into this. And I think at the time we were like, kind of jealous of our friends who got to play and hang out and do all these fun things, and we thought we were missing out. But in hindsight, I'm like, that put me years ahead as an adult. Like, I've built up my businesses, I built up my net worth, you know, far ahead of anyone who was just hanging out as a kid. So
yeah,
in hindsight, it's 2020.
Yeah, see, and see where it got you today, right? So, you know,
Yeah.
all these life experiences that we didn't expect how our life would turn out. But I thought that with this documentary, it was really interesting because talk about the different generations, right? Like some of the younger kids say, oh, I want to go do my own thing. I don't want to follow in the donut business anymore.
Yeah.
But then we saw like some people who came back and modernize it. You know, there's one girl who like, you know, put it on social media and Instagram and made it even bigger than what her family ever did. So I thought that was really interesting too. And Vida, talk to me a little bit about that, because you grew up in a restaurant family, right? It expanded from one. And I think you told me about your dad's, you know, his experience of dealing with prejudice at the time, right? And then that kind of spurred him and motivated him to actually be better because of those experiences.
Right, exactly. So my father worked in a very famous restaurant in Fisherman's Wharf, and he was a dishwasher there. And think about back in the, you know, late 1950s, early 1960s, Chinese were not considered, they were not welcome. Because with the Chinese Exclusion Act, think about it, it lasted in the 1800s, that's 62 years where Chinese could not come to America. And if they did, they were considered second-class citizen. So he worked as a dishwasher and he worked as a cook at a Chinese restaurant at night. And when he was doing the dishes one day, the lady just didn't like him, or I don't know what the issue was. And she goes, "You're fired today." And he just like, "No, why?" And then he turned around and says, "Well, one of these days I'm going to open my restaurant." And he walks out, right? Then he goes home trying to think about, now I got to tell my mother, at that time there's 5 of us. And he was like, now I'm out of one income, right? What are we going to do? So that's when he went and talked to his friends, people at the restaurant. And also in that time, San Francisco had a community center for people that comes from China. They would go to this community center to learn how to, you know, translate the letters that they get, or help them translate any type of paperwork they need, or to send money back home. And this is where they can connect and come together and help each other with services. So with that, everybody decided to help my father and pull in the money together to help him open his first restaurant. So the restaurant was in San Francisco. It's so Chinese and American food. So we had like chop suey and egg foo young. And I'm telling people, it's like, that's really not Chinese food, but you know, they didn't know, and you had to cater to their food, right? So we had like, and then we had like the, you know, special days, roast pork or chicken. So it was like this crazy menu of things that they serve, open from morning to night. And as kids in the household, just like Kathy said, we had to help out in the restaurant. I was washing dishes at 8 or 9 years old, standing on top of a wooden box, trying to, because back in those days, they didn't have a dishwasher machine, okay? So everything had to be done by hand. So these are the experiences that, you know, I understand what she means totally. We didn't get to go slumber party or birthday parties or go to people's house, right? What other kids did, right? We had to work in the restaurant, but we always had food. And my mom goes like, thank goodness we had a restaurant, because 5 of us, my 3 brothers can eat anyone out of house and home, right? But there's something that we grew up and we learned to be a translator for our parents. We learned to help them fill out application form when they bought first house, and how do you fill out these form and become like, you know, I was filling out application form for credit lines to buy a house even before I knew that exists, right? So these are things that we do as a child growing up. But you're right, Kathy, with this we're only a restaurant business that's open for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We have long hours, right? And there's never enough family member to help in business, right? So we do that, right? And then growing up in San Francisco, that restaurant we had for 10 years, that area became really, it changed, where there's a lot of issues and problems, where at one time the coffee shop, a person came in, brought a gun and told my mom he wanted an apple pie. My mom said 15 cents for the apple pie. And he goes, no, woman, give me the apple pie. And she wouldn't stand down, right? But this shows her strength, that, you know, she's not going to let people bully her around, because they do, that's going to escalate to more issue in the beginning and in the future, right? But I can tell you, a couple of months later, we moved out of that restaurant and then opened another restaurant. And from that restaurant, we had someone, back in the days, they didn't have Yelp. So somebody used to come in and write in the pink page on weekends, where do you go, which restaurant you go to, right? And they wrote about our restaurant. And because of that article, our restaurant had lines around the corner for, for hours for people to go in. So these are stories that talks about the American dream and how we have one restaurant and eventually open 11 locations, bring other family members, sponsor them, right, to come to America, help them build their restaurant or help them have the school and raise families, right? So these are the stories that I hear. And there's also some sadness in some of these stories. Some of these places didn't do well, or some of these restaurants some of the owners didn't do well, or problem with staffing and issues, in the community. But yeah.
I think it's great. And you telling that story, just linking it back to Ted's story and the growth of that. And I was surprised. I actually, I know, Mark, you grew up in Southern California. I did not know about the whole Cambodian, takeover of the donut shops, where they still own like tens of thousands of these shops there. And, we're able to fend off Dunkin' Donuts. No offense, Kathy, to your family's early business of Dunkin' Donuts, but fended off Southern California, able to have this kind of empire, which I thought was really interesting. But Mark, you studied, and you teach Asian American studies. Talk to me about that whole historical aspect of this documentary, how she was able to, woven all that in together, and how that was effective, and through just watching that and you teaching this historical perspective too. Oh, and unmute yourself for me.
Good, because what I said didn't even matter. It was perfect. It was perfect. I did the right part. I actually just wanted to, to briefly just comment, if I could, on both Kathy and Vida's point, and where the conversation was kind of, talking about the American dream. And I actually had, a little bit more of a critical take on it, right? And I think the documentary shows this, where, I think it raises questions of is the American dream possible for Asian immigrants? We'll just talk about Asian immigrants. Is the American dream possible without family labor, without child labor? Because essentially it's free labor, right? They're not getting paid. And so is it possible if you have to actually pay workers living wages? And I think that's a pressing question today, where, a lot of Asian immigrant restaurant owners, food service workers, small business owners, rely on that unpaid family labor. And so that's a critical question about our economy and our system, right? Is it possible to do it without this free labor, essentially? And then I think the other thing that's really important, and it always gets overlooked with this story, is the part about Winchell's and the training. And Frederick kind of hinted at this. It was an affirmative action program that was created to help minority and marginalized communities learn the donut trade. And it was started in the 70s. And this is from an LA Times article in the 1980s that covered Ted Ngoy. And they pointed this out. It's an affirmative action program. So without that program, I would argue that there would be no Ted Ngoy, right? There would be no donut empire if that opportunity wasn't open to him and that opportunity wasn't created. Right. And so I think that I just really want to emphasize that, because it gets so overlooked that it wasn't just, hey, he learned how to do this because of this program, but that program was created to help marginalized groups. Right. And I think that's a lesson.
And I think I read that he was the first Southeast Asian trainee under, I don't know if it's that just particular Winchell or the entire program, but it was very rare, for, and I think because of that, he was able, and he still thanked till today, this opportunity by Winchell's. And he said he felt guilty too, because all these people that trained through Winchell's, and then they came out and opened their shops and became the main competitors to Winchell. So that was interesting. But I think that perspective is really interesting, just with, you said labor, and that's the culture, right? Asian Americans, not just here, but in Asia, it becomes this family, families step in and help each other. That's just we didn't think of it as labor. We think it's family loyalty, right? We do that for our families. We help our families and, push through success. Federick, talk to me about that. I mean, just kind of that whole culture, and what do you think about what Mark said about, his take on this whole thing?
Oh, I agree. I didn't know that. Thanks for sharing that, Mark. I did not know that it was an affirmative action program that was sort of the beginning of this. That's a very important fact that, obviously wasn't really directly stated in the in the documentary. yeah, I mean, to add that it's not just family labor, it's undocumented labor, it's under the table labor. Like,
Yeah.
you know, it's the donut industry for Cambodian Americans is possible because it's a low overhead, and it's a low overhead because the labor is
All these factors.
essentially free.
Yeah.
And people, and it's, you know, working very long hours all day long. You know, when my family members who worked in or owned donut shops, they were working 16 hours plus. And so even though it may look successful in the end, it is a lot of extraction of labor. So
yeah.
I just wanted to address Mark's question because I work with so many small business owners, and my personal friends and my clients are small business owners. So 100% the American dream is possible legally, without free labor, without under the table stuff. You know, I grew up with that, but you know, with the Asian Tiger Mom, nothing is free. Despite the fact that I helped her build all this, nothing is free. So I started from zero. She didn't give me any trust. She didn't give me my like seed money. I built that from nothing. So, you know, from college, I worked a part-time job. I had an e-commerce business, and I graduated with zero debt, 10 grand in savings, worked full-time in a big corporate for years, and just saved every penny I could. And that's how I started to build my own portfolio. I didn't ask for a handout because I knew, like, I was like, I help with that struggle, but I'm not asking for a handout. I want to work for this. And I have so many friends that same thing, you know, they're the children of immigrants, and they did the same thing. You know, they sacrificed, they went to school, they worked part-time or full-time, they did an e-commerce business, and it's just willing to make that sacrifice. And I think, you know, I'm the biggest critic, I guess, when people try to blame external circumstances. I don't believe in that victim mentality. I think if you want to do something, you'll make it work. Like right now, I'm training an agent under me, and she's amazing. You know, she knows that in real estate, it takes time to build a reputation. It takes time to build your clientele. So she's bartending 4 nights a week, working at a pool on the weekends, and working with me 5 days a week, you know, and it's 3 jobs that the other jobs pay the bills while she's waiting for her commission checks. And that's the kind of life I lived for years. So even though I'm only in my early 30s, since I was in college, I worked 2 to 3 jobs while going to school full time. And so I think it's totally possible. And I have so many friends that have done that, where they built 1, 2, or 3 businesses, just bootstrapping it. You know, my business partner, Lisa, which I think a lot of you guys know as well, she's a community leader, business leader as well. And, you know, such an inspiration to me. She did the same thing. She worked at a law firm, saved all her money, and bootstrapped her first startup until she can afford it. You know, she was going to work at the law firm full time, which is really, really long hours, and then baking in the evenings, baking on the weekends. And we both did that. And that's why we came together, and we worked together so well, because we understand that sacrifice. We understand the 16-hour days, the 7 days a week, doing whatever you have to do. So, and we did it all legally. You know, we pay working living wages. We don't do anything under the table. We report all our taxes because we were born and raised here, and we understand the value of that and the importance of that.
I think it's interesting. And Mark, maybe you can talk on this a little bit, maybe the different generations, you know, like older generations and what they've gone through. And Vida, I think you can speak on this too, and what they've gone through. And then what Kathy is talking about too, a lot of younger people, but they still have that same drive. I think that drive was there back, you know, 2, 3 generations back, and that drive is there now. But, you know, all these different experiences, I mean, we don't, and that speaks to the point, we're not coming from the same place, but I think that drive, that mentality, that, you know, humble but hungry, you know, like that is all still there. But I mean, are we seeing a difference now from the old generations to this? I mean, any of you can be open to talk to that. Vida, what do you think?
So for sure, look, the new generation are smarter. They think smarter. The older generation can only do what they know, right? So if it's labor running the restaurant, but the new generation, as you've seen the donut shop, she changed it, did it more social media, pushing it out, doing, I mean, the younger generations living in a different time where we had to do manual labor. The younger generation can think outside that box. How do you make it more? And how do you, so I love that, right? So I was one of those mothers that pushed my kids to school. I want you all have a great degree, because I don't want them working those long hours I used to do, right? But I said, if you don't get a college degree and you don't have a good degree, you can always fall back and we have restaurants for you to run, right? But you won't have much of a life. You don't have much of a childhood life, right? But all my kids in the summer used to work at the restaurant because that restaurant gives you the background. If you can open a restaurant with all those, taking care of the customers, taking care of the kitchen, taking care of everything together, because a donut shop is easier because there's certain product you have, right? But when you open a restaurant, there's like appetizers to this, to that, right? There's that whole gamut, right? If you can run that business, you can run any business. And in life, whatever you do, even my nonprofit, I run it like a business. Because I'm going to think about how I'm going to keep that door open year after year after year to service my community for free and educate my community, right? So.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Thank you, Vida, for that. Federick, let's talk a little bit about the whole political perspectives of this, and just, you know, we when we heard Ted's story when he came, you know, just that kind of after, you know, the fall of the Khmer Rouge, and then the Khmer Rouge took over, and then, you know, a lot of immigrants came, or refugees came into this country, and now, you know, where at the time I think it was President Ford who was like, you know, we want the immigrants here, but not everybody was happy about that, you know. I mean, it was just, but how do you compare to what's happening now? Like, were you thinking about that while you're watching this documentary?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who has experienced, you know, whose family has experienced being welcome by somebody at least to the United States, and, you know, the first few years here, my parents were in, like, you know, workforce training programs and given opportunities to get to learn English and go to school, and so that, you know, obviously I've grown up with just a appreciation for those kinds of social supports for immigrants. And so it was very disheartening to, you know, to see, you know, reduced support for immigration and refugees under the previous administration and the current administration. The continued, so a big issue in the Cambodian American community and other Southeast Asian communities right now is deportation. You know, deportation of oftentimes people who came at a very young age, and you know, through agreements with Cambodia and Laos, etc., and I think Vietnam too, if they have committed some kind of felony, they are also eligible for deportation after serving their time. And so this is, you know, there's a lot of issues currently still for the Cambodian American community and Southeast Asian American communities that you know, many organizations are working and advocating for. So, you know, my personal opinion is that, you know, I can do what I can as a son of, you know, refugees to support and advocate for policies that are humane and that are caring and loving towards people who are fleeing places of violence and conflict.
Mark, what's your take on that? And you studied this in pretty, you know, intensely, just talking about different experiences. I mean, when it comes to politics and what's going on right now, immigration, what's kind of your takeaway just after watching the story, just kind of everything that you've learned in the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the story is trying to make a case, obviously, that, you know, immigrants and refugees contribute to American society, and rightfully so. I mean, I think I agree with that statement and with that point. I think what's really interesting too is, you know, there's the debate around, you know, immigration and refugees, and it covers, like, you know, what's the economic impact going to be? What is the cultural impact going to be? And I think what Federick had mentioned and Vida had mentioned, everybody really mentioned, is that I think this is another example where, you know, American society and American culture, you know, there's been a lot of talk over the last decades around, like, we don't feel a sense of community anymore. Like, people feel disconnected. And this is, like, you know, if you want to, there's a study by Robert Putnam, as a sociologist, who argues that over the last 70 years, this sense of community has declined. But if you want to find and look for examples of where people are building community and strong communities, you look no further than immigrant communities, including Asian Americans, right? Like, this is a model for, you know, if you're trying to build relationships and build social relationships with people, here's an example of how that's being done, and stop blaming immigrants for ruining community in America, essentially, right? Like, we're actually a model for how to build and maintain stronger ties with each other.
No, I love that. And, you know, I think with ACDC, that's definitely an example, you know, how you're trying not just bring one one group, but, you know, all our groups together, and how can we be stronger because of that, you know, because we share, I mean, yes, we are all different, but we also share kind of, you know, similar mentality to, you know, trying to succeed. And it's just been hard. And I know, you know, especially Vida and Mark, you've been on recent panels just talking about anti-Asian hate, you know, the discrimination and violence since this whole pandemic and even before that. So, you know, I mean, what's your take? I mean, and Kathy, as a young person, and how has that affected you? Has that even come into kind of your business mentality and people talking about that? Have you thought about that much? Has it affected you personally in some ways?
It's actually been the opposite for me, to be honest. Like, it's kind of what Mark touched upon about the community. And so commercial real estate's a really, really white male dominated industry, even to this day and age. Like, across the board, you'll see like most of these big commercial real estate firms, it's white men in their 30s to 60s, you know. In all of Vegas, I am like the one Asian woman that actually specializes in this and like does only commercial real estate. I don't do any residential, and I've done it for over 10 years and survived this industry. Mm-hmm. And so what I've seen is actually a lot of support and a lot of appreciation and gratitude from my fellow agents. I work with a lot of actually restaurant owners. That's one of my main clients, Asian restaurant owners, and they appreciate like the value I bring, because they're like, wow, like, you know, like they never knew that all this stuff, like all the things I negotiate for them, because they didn't know people like me existed. Mm. And so I'm able to help them. I'm able to make an income while making an impact. So it's a win-win for everyone. Like, some of these, it's because of the language barrier. Some of them it's because they didn't have the connections, because a lot of these guys who are in the industry for a while, they only want to work with that big corporate, that regional, national franchise or tenant or whatever. And so they don't know, like, oh, I didn't know I can negotiate. Like, I got one of my clients like $100 in a tenant improvement allowance, which is huge for building out a restaurant. You know, things like that, where I've been able to help them a lot. And then that support comes full circle, you know, and so they're so appreciative. So I think I've seen so much support from, and even like in the real estate industry specifically, like a lot of residential agents, they send all their clients to me because they're like, you're the only Asian commercial broker I know. So now all my Asian clients are going to go to you for commercial real estate. So I feel like it's the opposite, where being Asian and being a minority has created this whole like sphere of influence and this whole circle of trust where we cross refer business, we support one another, whether it's within the real estate industry or with other business owners that I know in different industries, in like cleaning or restaurants or whatever, or spa. Like, we all refer business to one another just because it's like we want to support Asian businesses.
Yeah. No, that's great. And that's great to hear, because you do want to see, I mean, there are negative stories and we've heard so many of that. Sure. But at the same time, we're also seeing lots of positive stories and people coming together to support each other too. And that's been happening. You know, you saw in Ted's story how they've helped each other and sponsored families to come in. Mark, what are the challenges we're still facing? I mean, what are you seeing still out there that we need to conquer? I mean, obviously there are issues and there are problems we still have to face as a community. What are you seeing as something that we need to kind of still face and maybe talk more about?
Yeah, the coded language of, you know, there's been a lot of great studies of like Asian Americans who, for example, have moved into suburbs, right? And this is Ted Ngo's story. He moved into Mission Viejo, right? And how that movement and migration of Asian Americans into the suburbs, which is seen as like a success story. And, you know, it is access to these communities that have been previously closed off because of like literal policies in housing deeds that said you can't sell to Asians. So this movement into the suburbs, but then when you start to get this movement, it becomes whatever success Asian Americans tend to have, you know, it could be like, oh, their house is too big. So you can't have houses that are too big in this neighborhood. And so then like homeowners associations get together and develop policies. This is happening like, you know, San Francisco, Southern California, places like San Marino, California. And so you get these ways that are kind of like, it's not outright. And that's the challenge, right? Is like, it's no one's going to say this outright. But when you say things like you can't mansionize your home or you can't do these things and it's targeted towards Asian Americans, we got to be able to kind of to see that, right? And I think what Kathy pointed out is also a good example, right? Where like Asian Americans, Asians supporting each other. I mean, that's a sign of strength for our community. And then on the outside in, it could be seen as like, see, they stick together. They don't want to contribute. They just want to like help each other out. And I'm like, but that's not, it is a contribution, right? But it's like, we have to help those of us who are still trying to enter into this space.
And I think that's what's so important and why stories like this are important, because it kind of puts a face to, you know, not just a group. Oh, all the Asians are helping each other. Like, who are all the Asians? Like, we're all different. You know, I mean, we're not all business owners. We're journalists. We're nonprofits. You know, we're small business. We're educators. So we're all different. Yes, we're supporting each other, but don't think of it as just that one group. And I think it's so important to tell all these different stories all the time. And as, you know, members of the media, I think we have that responsibility to share all these different stories. Get out and get all those perspectives and elevate them and let people know that, you know, Kathy's stories are different from, you know, Federick's story and Mark's story and Vida's story. We all have different stories. And I think this is just one of them. But yes, there's still challenges. People still see us as one group, which I think is really sad. But I think hopefully that is changing. Federick, and just as a Cambodian American, you know, do you think these stories, we need to tell more of these? What other stories are we missing? What kind of perspectives should we put out there, especially where you are, you know, teaching at UNLV? What are you hearing and what are you seeing?
Thanks for the question. So I think the word that comes to mind, or the idea that comes to mind, is the model minority myth, right? And I think as much as this story is, you know, wonderful in a lot of ways and demonstrates resilience and the things we've talked about, like this kinship and the connectedness and social capital within a community, you could also run with the narrative that, yeah, if you work really hard, you will get ahead and be successful. And that, you know, that is part of the narrative of the model minority myth, right? Which shows that, you know, which suggests that Asians are successful because they work hard, right, in this like meritocratic society. But in reality, there are significant challenges when you disaggregate, when you look across different Asian subgroups. For example, you know, like Southeast Asians, Laotians and Cambodians still have some of the lowest educational attainment rates and are amongst the poorest Americans, actually, poorest American households. And so I think, you know, it's like a double-edged sword, like I said in the beginning. Like, it's a nice story because we love those kinds of stories, these like American dream success stories. But that the story itself feeds into this broader idea that we need to this model minority myth that we need to actively combat by telling more stories. Right.
Well, Vida, I think you have a story you want to share, especially pertaining to this, right?
Right. So when we talk about Asians only working, helping with Asian, okay, one of the reasons why is language. They go to Kathy because Kathy can understand Chinese and they can communicate better, right? So this is a story what happened where when the first pandemic hit Las Vegas, right, in the world, right? But Las Vegas was hit by these businesses, right, Asian business. So like November, December, January of 2019, 2020, right? People wouldn't go to the Asian restaurants or business or store because they thought they will get the virus from us if they go to the restaurant to eat or things like that. So here we are located right on top of Shanghai Plaza in the Asia Town area. The business just dropped completely and people wouldn't go because they thought about that. So what we had to do was trying to help our community at that time and say, we need to give them some business, right? So we will have, like, when we feed the frontliner, we will go back to these Asian businesses and then order the bento boxes from them to get the food out to the frontliner, or have other groups, you know, come together. Let's get the masks. The Chinese Nevada Association brought in 40,000 masks, disposable masks, to get out to the hospital in March. So as a community, we come together to help everyone. But when our community get hit, we help each other because of, number one, language. You know, we have to help some of the small business owners and so forth. So it gets to a point where they say, oh, you only help each other. Well, if we don't support each other and help each other when it comes to language, who will? Yeah. Will anybody else be there for us?
And Federick, you was talking about the model minority, Vida, and I think we talked about that before, how people perceive us as, oh, the pandemic doesn't affect us because, we're all successful, we have money, we're not, unemployed. But we learned that that's not the case, right? There are plenty of Asian American, Pacific Islander who are affected pretty greatly. Before we move on, though, I wanted to touch on some of the comments and questions from the audience, which I'm kind of going through now, and see if some of you wanted to bring this up. One person was talking, one person actually commented on the great point about family labor and immigrant and Asian American communities, families. They say the kids know it's labor, but we're expected to do it because of, the parents, it's expected in the family, which we should talk about, which is great. One question though, let's see, the challenge of second generation kids being pulled between their academic, professional aspirations and carrying on the family business seems to be a common thread among many immigrant communities. Can you speak to how that tension affects the immigrant experience in the US? Okay, the challenge between second generation. Anyone want to talk on this? Mark or Federick or Kathy, anyone or Vida? Can you speak to how the challenge of second generation kids being pulled between their academic professional aspirations and carrying on the family business seems to be a common thread with many immigrant communities. Can you speak to how that tension affects the immigrant experience in the US?
Yeah, I mean, I can take a quick stab at that. I mean, I don't know if I can fully flesh out, how that shapes the second generation experience, but I think what was really interesting is, I hadn't thought about this until I watched the documentary, but the second generation Cambodian Americans actually going into the donut industry is it's not an obvious thing, and it's not a clear-cut decision, right? I think at least my theory or my interpretation of why that's happening, I mean, we see the same thing happening with Thai Americans going into the restaurant industry. I think, and this is where, I'll push back on what Kathy said earlier, where I think external factors are at play, because I think if there was a different economy where a college degree would mean what it did 30 years ago, I don't know if these kids would, or not kids, but I don't know if these young Khmer Americans would want to go back into the donut industry. I think in a way, it's sort of like, I'm studying, I don't know what I'm gonna do, because it's not clear what this path is for me anymore. And I don't know what this degree is worth, but I know this industry. And I think this is gonna be my fallback. Like she said, she's like, this was plan B. But we have to take that into consideration, that why is she at plan B? And it's not a failure necessarily, but I think it does suggest something about something else is not available and not open to second generation Asian Americans as it once was for their parents maybe. And so now they're kind of shifting back to say, well, I'll just stick in the family business and bring my lens as growing up Asian American, knowing technology, knowing social media, and I'll put my spin on it. But the fact that they're staying in it, because we also don't want to romanticize the donut industry, right? It's like, this is, low wage, they're small businesses, but it's food service work, right? And like Vida mentioned, her parents were like, don't do this. I don't want you to work in a restaurant anymore. So there's this aspiration. And so then to see the second generation come back, I think tells us that there's something larger at play here. And it's not just, I love donuts so much, I really want to stay committed to this industry, but it's like, there's something else going on. And so I think that's an important dynamic that was at play in the documentary. That speaks, I think, to that generational tension. It's generational, but it's also, we got to think of the moment. We're at a different historical moment.
Circumstances, especially this past year, we're all been affected in many different ways, right? So I think that, Kathy, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like there's Steve Jobs once said, you can't connect the dots going forward, you can only connect them going backwards. And, I specialize in commercial clearly, but my family was, before me, is mostly just residential. So it's related, but not exactly the same. And, I took that corporate route for 3 or 4 years, and I made that choice to take over the family business because I wanted to. It wasn't like because I was forced to. And I've seen a lot of my friends, colleagues, some people I know personally, some people I've read their stories. One of my personal favorites is like, I don't know if you guys know New York, but Xi'an Famous Foods, I love their noodles. They're like really famous, and it used to be like this little basement hole in the wall spot when the dad founded it. And then it became this massive, like multiple location thing because it was kind of touching back on what Vida said, like the newer generation brings their skills and the best practices and their new ideas from different aspects of their lives, and revolutionizes the business. So they make it better, you know, and it's just, I don't know, I feel like there's this new generation, even though I'm in my 30s, that my business partner and I often talk about it. It's like the shiny object syndrome, where people are always like, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to like be happy and find my calling in life. And I'm like, right. You know, there's a million ways for you to make money. There's a million ways for you to be successful. Consistency and discipline in any field, you know, whether it's your family business or starting your own business or going out in a different field. I think in this day and age, there's just that lack of consistency and discipline. People are so transient and so like easy to give up. I think that's the key issue with, like, honestly, the second generation. It's like, it's hit or miss. Some people are super grateful. Like, I'm super grateful that I have this opportunity, so I want to take full advantage. And the other part of it is that because their parents were so successful, they have this silver spoon and now they don't know the struggle anymore. And they're like, well, I can fall back on my parents, so I can go explore and do what makes me happy and be a liberal arts major.
Yeah, no, yeah, Federick, and let's get to you. And are you doing what your parents thought you were going to do? I mean, what was that kind of expectations coming from your Cambodian refugee parents in Southern California?
Yeah, they definitely told me not to enter the food business. They worked in it ever since they got to the United States in the 80s, and they worked a lot, and they're tired. They knew the reality of it. Am I doing what they thought? Not quite. But then again, I think refugees maybe are different from immigrants in a way, because they didn't come here with like for aspirations. They came here to survive. And so I didn't grow up actually with a lot of push in any certain direction or any kind of like tiger parenting, so to speak. And to think about your previous question, yes, if I think about Long Beach, Cambodia town right now, like, yeah, there are some younger Cambodian Americans who have like transformed their parents' businesses, like the Phnom Penh Noodle Shack. It's really, really great and like really hip. There's some donut shops that do like fun Instagrammable donuts and things like that. But I wouldn't say like there's a big passing of the torch to the second generation, at least not among the people that I know. They're trying to pursue these other things. And I think, like Mark said, many of them have encountered obstacles in that path.
Yeah, no, and we're close to wrapping up here, but I really, it's just been interesting, and just watching the story, thinking, just this overview theme. We were talking about American Dream and and I have to bring to the point that, actually someone asked in the audience here, is this story known in Vegas before this documentary? Because it does have a Vegas tie. We haven't brought this up yet. The fact that Ted demise came during, because he came into Vegas and started gambling and started losing all his money and had to give his shops away. And Vida, you talked a little bit about how you saw that personally happen to people in the food industry, how gambling became kind of demise for them as well, right?
Sure. Yeah. So when we opened our restaurant in the Bay Area, in San Francisco area, one place we did not want to go to was Las Vegas. And we came to Las Vegas a couple of times, but we knew that our employees would have issue with gambling, where they would, on the free time, because here you work in the restaurant, you might be putting 8 to 10 hours a day, right? What are you going to do with the rest of the 14 hours, right? So they will go to the casino and play because they're trying to pass by time, right? And they get hooked. And I can tell you, when I moved to Las Vegas, helping my in-laws and family for a while, they had a restaurant. And I was helping them with the restaurant because they know that that's my background, right? But I couldn't believe some of the employees that would work there, that half of the time they are all gambling so much that they don't even take care of the household. I don't know how his daughters survive without the parents. I used to be when I would be at home, I would have kids come over to play with my kids. And it's like a Monday night or Tuesday night. I said, it's 11 o'clock at night. Why are you still here? And he goes like, oh, my parents are either working graveyard shift in the casinos or they're gambling. Who's watching these kids grow up, right? I'm surprised she became a doctor, but these are stuff that I know that our community has issue is gambling. It's a very addictive, right? And like I said, this gambling issues is one thing about the Asian community, has been around forever. My sister-in-law's his dad gambled so much that he gave to pay off the gambling debt, he had to give the daughter away to the household to raise. It was horrible in that situation. But these are stories that we talk about in the Asian community when they gamble. It is an addiction that's probably one of the worst addiction in our community, where some addiction would be alcohol and drug. For the Asian community, it is gambling. And I can tell you stories after stories of what happened, especially in restaurant owners, when they have that time that, they get hooked on that. So the story they told me is like, yep, I know exactly what they're doing. And I tell people, I ask people to move to Las Vegas, I said, there's one rule. If you move to Las Vegas, you can't gamble. And I have a rule where, I'm sorry for my donors that donates to me, right? I do not gamble in the town I live in. You will never see me in a casino at the table. You see me at the casino going to events, but you never see me gamble, because I want to make sure I set the example, not only for me, but for everybody else. And the same thing for my kids and so forth. I push that whole, if you gamble, it's for fun. Just remember, put aside, you're going to gamble $600 or $1,000, whatever money you want to play when you come visit. That's it. Do not go to your credit card and get more money out, right? Just think of it as an entertainment.
Yeah.
If they can do that, that's fine.
Yeah. No, Ted's story really, the ups and downs, it was an incredible story, right? Like how he started this with nothing and just built this empire and then lost it, how Las Vegas was a character in this too. I did not know that story, according to what this person was asking. I did not know the story before. So that was really kind of eye-opening. But yeah, no, any final words? Kathy, just watching this, thinking about your own experience, what was kind of your final, your parting words from just kind of this experience?
I think it's, especially in today's environment and everything, to remember history. I feel like a lot of people forget that, from down to the political part of it, like communism, that's what they fled. People forget what communism does, what it did to society, what it did to Cambodia, and a lot of other countries. And then all the sacrifices that people have made. I think we have so much to be grateful for. And just seeing how they were, when they didn't even have food to eat. They had one bowl of rice to share with the whole group. They were working in the field, what is that, 14, 16 hours a day. And it just, I feel like my key takeaway, and I wish everyone in schools, I think this is the type of things that schools should be teaching. Gratitude, mindset, you'll hear me talk about all the time. Everyone who works with me, everyone who I mentor, I talk about that. I'm being grateful and being appreciative for the life we live and all the opportunities we have, the American dream and just living in America is such a blessing. And I think we all need to remember that, because we have food, we have shelter, we have friends, we have community, we have all this stuff. And seeing that this is 1970s, this isn't 100 years ago. This is within people, the people that fled that are still here today, and they're still in our communities. And it's crazy to think that people grew up like that. I didn't know, honestly. I didn't know that they came from those circumstances. And it's crazy, sleeping next to dead bodies. That to me is just insane.
Yeah.
And so, my key takeaway is just, I'm so grateful for the life I have and the life I live. And I hope everyone who lives anywhere in America remembers that and stops focusing on the negative and stops complaining about everything. Because if you look at how these people lived when they were children, not getting your toy, not getting things, it's nothing compared to what they had to go through.
Yeah, that's great perspective. Mark, what about you? Oh, and unmute yourself again.
One of the things that I'm grappling with is whether or not, in a good way, right? I'm kind of thinking this through, is whether or not this story is typical or atypical, right? Is this a typical, and this is what I would leave, everybody watching the documentary to, figure it out for themselves, right? Is this a typical story of, one, a Cambodian refugee experience, Asian American experience, or is this an atypical one, which is the reason why a documentary was made, right? That perhaps this is not a typical story. And so then what is the quote unquote larger experience of the Cambodian American community? And I think again, use this to not stop with this story as the story of this community, right? That this is one story of a very exceptional figure with a very fascinating tale, right? Of, like you said, of a rise and a fall that is made for movies. And so I think that to take this experience and to really just, think more deeply about, where does this fit into the broader history of the Khmer community and Asian American experience?
Yeah, and we don't hear a lot about that. I mean, I really personally have not heard much about the Cambodian community here, and we have Federick, who that's his life story. Your parents' life story. So, what did you take away from this? What do you think really stood out for you?
Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines as Mark. Like this, it's not a typical story. This is, one person who, through his actions did help to uplift many, many families, but a lot of the donut shop owners that I know, like they're not multi-billionaires having lavish parties at Omnia. Like they're not
right.
living that life. Like they're getting by. This is a business that they could enter because it required less English. It required low overhead, low entry, and so I think really what the documentary for me is an invitation and reminder to explore more of the Cambodian American, Khmer American experience. And so things like deportation, which I mentioned, access to jobs and ability to enter the workforce, support for elders, etc. One funny story I would like to share that's connected to this. So as an undergrad, I was one of the few Khmer Americans at Stanford, and so we had a physical Facebook, like a picture book with everyone's face. And my freshman year, I didn't really feel connected to all these East Asians that were there, and so I hunted down through the Facebook all the other people who I thought were Cambodian Americans, and I found a total of 4. And then me and my other friends, we started the Stanford Cambodian Cultural Association. And one of the first things that we did was we started a boycott of Krispy Kreme donuts. At the time, Krispy Kreme donuts had moved actually into Long Beach. And I remember there was a huge buzz, a craze about the lines were miles, right? And it was just of all the places you could build Krispy Kreme, erect a Krispy Kreme, is Long Beach, California, where there's so many small business owners and donut shops. So, I share that story just to bring up the point of the gentrification of the communities that we're in, including Cambodia Town, Long Beach, and what is the plan for the sustenance and sustainability of this community and the people that are actually there.
Yeah.
So the documentary, it's a story of one man, and it's an atypical story, but it directs me to think more about how I can be using my position and how we can collectively support and organize for, against these big issues: gentrification, deportation, immigration, etc.
That's great. And I don't know if you remember that part of the documentary where they talked about how Krispy Kreme came into Southern California in one neighborhood where there was a donut shop owned by a Cambodian family across the street. And they actually did better because all these people went and supported them to be anti-Krispy Kreme, so I thought that was a really cool part of the story. So so I love that. I love that support. Vida, what about you? What's your takeaway? What do you want people to think about? And I think this is really great to think about how, it's not just about this man's story, right? It's a bigger picture of the Asian American Pacific Islander experience. And I think it's really great to see a different face, but also there's so many other faces out there.
So this is how I feel. More stories about Asian and what we have contributed to this country is needed. The educational piece is what I want to see more of, right? Where they feel we're always so invisible, we're all rich, and we're all this modern minority. But when we have stories like this, even though his story was really successful, but then he lost everything, it's still a story of of the Asian coming to this country, right? But we need more stories. We need to educate that. The Asian works hard. It wasn't, they work long hours. You see this documentary, even though he was lucky, but there's many that wasn't as lucky.
Yeah.
But for them to not recognize that we exist and how much we have contributed to this country and treat us with this whole anti-Asian hate That's not something new. It's been around since the 1800s. Then we got the Japanese internment camp. Then we got the Vincent Chin with the auto dealership, right? Now we're talking about this virus that we brought over, and it's like, stop. We need to stop repeating ourselves. And we don't educate our community. We don't have education about Asian history in elementary school or in school, and how much we have done, us building the railroads back in the days. Who was building that? And any pictures you have, documentary picture, you never see an Asian face there. I can tell you, they had, Chinatown came from the whole thing during the gold rush time, where Chinatown, where Chinese people coming together to exchange food, to cook ginger or whatever food they might have, and build a little thing, because the food they weren't used to. That's why Chinatown was born, right? So now we use everything in Chinatown, but now it's really Asia Town, right? We have to bring people together. But going back to education, education, education. Whatever story we can bring needs to be told, and what we have contributed.
And that's why it's so great. And Vegas PBS and PBS in general, the Asian American documentary that came out, I think late last year into this year, that opened the eyes of so many people that did not know. And that became kind of educational piece, right? I was sharing with everybody, watch this story on PBS. It's great because a lot of people, even Asian Americans haven't really seen a lot of these stories. So I appreciate, and I thank Vegas PBS for holding this and for airing this documentary and inviting us to be part of this. Thank you, Vida with ACDC, Catherine Kuo, Federick Ngo, and Mark Padoongpatt for being part of this panel. I think it's been really insightful. I've learned a lot watching this documentary, and it makes me want to learn more, right? I think that's been the goal, and inviting Stephanie back into the conversation. Thank you for having all of us here today. It's been really great, and I hope that was good for you and your viewers as well.
Thank you so much, Patranya, and to all our panelists. Thank you for taking the time to be a part of this panel and for all you do for the community. And yes, this was such a great conversation. We're so grateful to have you guys. A huge thank you to our audience for joining us as well and participating with us. We hope you'll spread the word about this broadcast of The Donut King. It will be airing this Sunday on Vegas PBS at 11 p.m. or you can stream it on our website at vegaspbs.org. Please take a moment to complete our survey. It is in the chat box, and it is so crucial for our future events. We hope you will continue to rely on Vegas PBS to bring you documentaries like the one that you saw tonight. Thank you all again. Please enjoy the rest of your evening, and good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.